My name is Daniel Harker, and I should have died with the others when the flood came. I remember the screams of my neighbors, the sight of Clara Reynolds clinging to her rooftop as the black water swallowed her whole, and the way Marcus Lee vanished beneath the surface without even a ripple. I thought I was the only one left alive, but the truth is far worse. The flood didn't just take them, it kept them, and now it wants me too. The rain had been falling for days, a constant curtain of water that blurred the world into a gray haze. At first I told myself it was just another storm, that the river nearby had risen like it always did during bad weather, but this time felt heavier, as if the sky itself had broken open and decided it would never close again. The sound was endless, hammering on the roof, trickling down the walls, seeping through every crack in the house. I tried to pretend it was only weather, but deep inside I knew it wasn't. There was something about the way the rain fell that made it feel alive, like it wasn't just water falling but something darker, something with intent. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The streets were gone. When I peered out my window, all I could see was water stretching in every direction. The lamps that used to light the neighborhood had disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only faint glimmers where they once stood. Furniture, tree branches, and debris floated by in slow motion. At one point, I thought I saw a body drifting, arms spread wide as if in surrender. My heart stopped, but when I blinked, it was gone, swallowed into the black waves as if it had never been there at all. The power cut out that evening. One moment the lights were buzzing faintly, the next I was sitting in total darkness, the kind that made the walls seem to breathe. The only glow came from the water outside, reflecting the sickly silver light of the storm. I tried to sleep, curling into myself on the bed, but my body refused to rest. Every creak of the house felt too loud, every shift of the wind felt too close. The silence wasn't peaceful, it pressed against me, suffocating, like something was holding its breath, waiting for me to let my guard down. Then I heard it, a sound from below. At first I thought it was debris bumping against the walls outside, branches, maybe furniture, but the sound was too steady, too intentional. A hollow knocking, repeating in a slow rhythm, echoing up through the floorboards. I froze in place, straining to hear. The knocks came again, louder this time, and I realized with horror they weren't random. They were in patterns, like someone or something was trying to be heard. I pressed my hand to the floor, and the vibration met me immediately, strong and deliberate, as if whatever was below knew I was listening. I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping the dampness off against my clothes. The wood beneath my palm hadn't been dry, it had been slick, wet, as though the floodwater wasn't outside anymore but already inside, rising invisibly through the bones of the house. My throat tightened. I backed away from the spot and pressed myself against the wall, staring at the dark floor like it might break open at any second. The knocking didn't stop. It grew irregular, frantic, like fists pounding against a door, begging to be let in. I couldn't stay in my bedroom. I moved to the hallway, clutching the railing as I crept toward the staircase. But the sight at the bottom made my knees weaken. The first floor was gone, drowned beneath water that gleamed like oil. The surface wasn't commit rippled, as though something just beneath it was circling slowly, waiting for me to come closer. My reflection was warped, twisted into shapes that weren't my own. The air smelled foul, metallic and sour, making me gag. I clutched the railing tighter until my knuckles turned white. I retreated back into my room, shutting the door, though it gave me no real safety. The sound of water pressing against the walls was constant, like heavy breathing. It almost felt as if the house itself was alive, groaning beneath the weight of something ancient that had risen from the river. The rain hammered harder, masking every other sound, until I thought I heard whispers hidden in the rhythm of the drops. I told myself it was my imagination, just fear playing tricks. But when I leaned closer to the window, the rain slowed, just for a second, and I swore I could hear words, muffled, wet words, calling to me. I stumbled backward, knocking into the dresser. My heart pounded so loud I could hardly hear the storm anymore. I wanted to believe none of it was real, that I was only tired, hallucinating. But when I glanced down at the corner of the room, I saw the wallpaper peeling away in long, curling strips. Water was bleeding upward from the floor, dark and steady, spreading higher, inch by inch. The pattern on the wallpaper warped into shapes that looked too much like faces. And then I saw it drip from the ceiling above me. Not just water. Clear drops that clung to the plaster too long, forming round shapes before letting go. I stared at one, and in the instant before it fell, I thought I saw something pressing outward from inside the drop. A pale fingertip, tiny and fragile, as if something on the other side of the ceiling was reaching through, trying to touch me. By the time morning came, I realized the first floor of my house was completely gone. The staircase leading downward ended in black water that lapped against the steps, swallowing the familiar space where I used to sit with coffee and books. Now it was a reflectionless void, rippling without wind. My sofa, my table, everything I once lived with, had become shadows drifting beneath the surface. The water wasn't like any flood I'd seen before. It was too dark, too thick, as if it was holding something inside. I kept staring, waiting for it to settle, but faint movements beneath the surface kept drawing my eye. I told myself it was furniture or debris. Deep down I knew better. The silence of the house made every sound unbearable. I could hear the water shifting, sloshing softly against the walls, even though there was no current. When I leaned over the railing, I swore I saw something pale flash by beneath the surface. It vanished before I could be sure, but the way my body tensed told me I hadn't imagined it. Shapes moved down there, slow and deliberate, circling as though they were waiting for me to come closer. I forced myself back into my room, clutching my arms tight around my chest. Hunger gnawed at me, but the thought of going near the kitchen downstairs filled me with dread. I pictured myself wading waist-deep through that blackness, something brushing against my legs in the dark water. I knew I wouldn't return if I tried. The air itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The dampness had crept higher along the walls, staining the wallpaper in long streaks like veins. Every time I touched the surface, my fingers came back slick with moisture, and the house groaned faintly as if its wooden frame was struggling to hold itself upright. I sat near the window, staring out at the endless water. My neighborhood was gone, erased. Where the street once stretched, there was nothing but gray sky reflected in the water's skin. My neighbors' houses had vanished too. No rooftops, no chimneys, only the faintest impressions beneath the surface, as though the world had been drowned and flattened into memory. The longer I looked, the more I felt the weight of it pressing against me, as if the horizon itself was bending inward, trying to pull me under. When night came again, the sounds returned. The knocking was still there, sometimes faint, sometimes urgent, but it wasn't alone anymore. I could hear splashing against the walls, as though hands were dragging themselves along the siding. The thought of something climbing, pressing closer, kept me frozen in my bed. My eyelids burned with exhaustion, but I didn't dare close them. Every time I blinked, I imagined opening them to see something standing in the corner, dripping wet and grinning. Hours must have passed before I noticed the ceiling above me was leaking more steadily now. Drops fell in a rhythm, splattering against the floorboards. I counted them, one after another, until I realized they weren't falling randomly. The rhythm matched the knocking below. The sound from the ceiling and the pounding from beneath the floor were speaking to each other, as if they were communicating through the house itself. I crawled toward the far corner, desperate to get away, and that was when I saw the wallpaper bulging. The wetness had spread high enough that the surface of the wall swelled outward like something was pushing from the inside. It pulsed faintly, in and out, like shallow breathing. I pressed myself against the opposite wall, trembling so hard my teeth chattered, and the bulge shivered as if it had felt me watching. The storm outside roared louder, thunder cracking in the distance, but even that couldn't cover the sound I heard next. It wasn't splashing or knocking, it was dragging. Something was moving below the water, scraping against the walls, circling my house in long, deliberate loops. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the vibration still hummed through the floor, crawling up into my bones. When I finally dared to look at the window again, my breath caught in my throat. The glass was fogged, covered in condensation from the damp air, but on the outside, smeared across the pane, were streaks I hadn't noticed before. Long wet handprints dragged downward, overlapping each other, as though dozens of hands had pressed themselves against the glass. My body went cold. I hadn't heard anyone climb onto the second floor, but the evidence was there, clear as day. Something had been watching me from the other side of the glass. I staggered backward, keeping my eyes locked on the handprints. My chest tightened, every muscle screaming to run, though there was nowhere left to go. The house groaned again, louder this time, and the wallpaper bulge tore open with a soft rip. A single drop slid down, thicker than water, red at its core. I stared at it as it fell to the floor and spread out slowly, the color blooming wider until it looked like the house itself was bleeding. The storm had reached a point where it no longer sounded like weather at all. The thunder came in long, rolling growls, vibrating through the walls, as if something massive was circling just outside. Between those strikes, there was silence too deep to be natural, a silence that seemed to push into my ears until they rang. I pressed my palms against them, but it didn't help. The stillness was heavier than the noise, and within it, faint sounds began to crawl through wet, gurgling whispers, voices that weren't shaped by breath but by water itself. I tried not to listen, but the more I ignored them, the clearer they became. They slithered into my thoughts, murmuring words I didn't understand, words that made my skin itch from the inside. I thought I could escape them by opening the window, by letting the storm drown them out. But when I pushed it open, what I saw drained the last bit of hope out of me. The house wasn't standing in my neighborhood anymore, it was floating. All around me stretched endless black water, no trees, no houses, no streetlights. The world I knew had been erased. I stared at the horizon, but there was no horizon. The water stretched into gray sky without distinction, like I was trapped inside a holosphere. The air smelled sour, carrying no trace of earth or rain anymore, only rot. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the distance. A faint ripple against the still water, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The thought of being alone in this endless black sea was unbearable, but the thought of not being alone was even worse. I slammed the window shut, gasping for air as if I had been holding my breath. Night blurred into day, though the sky never changed color. It stayed the same pale gray, as though the sun had forgotten how to rise. I tried not to sleep, but exhaustion weighed me down. Each time my eyes closed, I dreamt of sinking arms bound, lungs filling with water so thick it felt alive, pressing deeper inside me. When I jolted awake, the whispers would still be there, dripping from the walls, vibrating in the floor, hissing just beneath my skin. The knocking had stopped, but I almost missed it now. What replaced it was far worse. The whispers grew sharper, words curling into sounds that clawed at my mind. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside, winding their way through the house, bouncing off the soaked wood and seeping into me. I pressed my hands to my ears until they hurt, but the voices didn't come through my ears. They were rising from my chest, bubbling up from inside me. I coughed until bile burned my throat, convinced water would spill out, but nothing came. When I staggered toward the mirror in the corner of the room, I froze. My reflection was not mine anymore. My face was pale, swollen, the skin stretched as if it had been submerged too long. My lips were cracked, but water glistened between them, trickling down my chin though I hadn't been drinking. I touched my cheek, and my reflection touched back, but its eyes didn't follow. They stared somewhere beyond me, wide and unblinking. I smashed the mirror with my fist before I could see more, but the moment the glass shattered, the whispers screamed in unison, so loud I thought my skull would split. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my head, and when the sound finally receded, I noticed something that froze my blood. Wet footprints, bare and small, stretched across the floorboards. They led from the shattered mirror to the corner of the room, stopping just before the shadows deepened. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would burst. I crawled backward, eyes locked on that corner, but nothing moved. The footprints gleamed in the dim light, proof that I was no longer alone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the dark. My body ached, but fear kept me rigid. Each creak of the house, each groan of the walls, felt like a step closer from whatever was lurking inside with me. The air had grown colder, every breath condensing into thin clouds, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the water was rising again, not from below this time but from within. When the silence deepened once more, I swore I could feel it, a thin, wet breath brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing, only the damp wall, streaked with stains that looked more and more like veins. But I knew it hadn't been my imagination. Something had leaned close enough to touch me, and when I listened hard enough, I realized the whispers weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from inside my head, repeating my name. I couldn't stay in the rooms any longer. The house felt like a lung slowly filling with water, each creak and sigh another breath taken on my behalf. I needed to get higher, to get above whatever was using the flood to crawl closer. The attic hatch resisted at first, swollen with damp, but I pried it open and climbed, each rung of the ladder slick with condensation. The air up there was colder and thin, like the world had been punched hollow and all the warmth had leaked out. My breath came ragged. My chest felt full of someone else's wet air. When I pushed through the last trapdoor, I expected shingles and sky. I expected a fragile piece of roof and the faint hope that if I could make it out there, I might see land, a rescue, anything that proved this had an edge. Instead, I found a corridor of darkness. The attic stretched farther than it should have, like the house had gotten longer while I slept. Old trunks and boxes lay scattered, soaked and sagging. The wooden beams bowed under a weight I could hear more than see, a faint, endless slosh, like water moving through some hidden pipe. I moved forward, keeping my hands on the rafters, because the floor felt wrong beneath my feet, where the attic should have been dry and safe. The boards wept. Thin lines of water ran like veins along the wood, and in the dim light, I could see stingy, wet fingerprints pressed everywhere, as if someone had crawled along on hands and knees. Exploring, the prints led to a hatch I had not remembered before, tucked in the far corner beneath an old quilt. The hatch was sealed with something dark and sticky. When I touched it, the adhesive pulled at my skin like a living thing, leaving a residue that smelled faintly of salt and rot. I forced my fingers under the edge and felt the seal give. It opened with a soft, sucking pop, and air rushed up that tasted of iron. Below the hatch was not another floor but a shaft, a round well of black water that descended deeper than my light could reach. The sound came from it, low and vast, like waves in a cavern. I pressed my face to the opening, and the cold hit me like a slap. Something moved in the water below, a slow turn that made the surface ripple outward in concentric circles. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale arm rise, the length of it too long, the fingers splayed like ragged roots. Then it sank, and the water stilled. I wanted to close the hatch and run, but my feet did something I did not tell them to do. I eased closer and began to climb onto the low roofline inside the attic, a narrow path between damp insulation and warped tiles. The shingles outside were slick when I finally pushed the small window open. My stomach flipped at the sight. The house was surrounded by a black field of water. But now I could see shapes under the surface more clearly, long pale things lying just beneath, their outlines constant and waiting. They shifted when I watched, slow as drowned trees. That was when I noticed the roof itself. Handprints glazed every tile, hundreds of them, overlapping in frantic patterns. They were not dry impressions. They sank into the surface like they belonged there. I could see fingernails, thin and elongated, the knuckles pressed until the skin stretched and left pale hollows. The prints led to the chimney, to the gutters, to each vent, circling back and aiming always at the same thing. My attic hatch. My heart pounded as though I had run a long distance, but my legs had barely moved. I traced one print with my fingertip. The paint was still tacky, and when I lifted my finger, a thin film stretched between it and the tile, like the web of a creature I could not see. The filament clung, then snapped, leaving my skin tingling, alive with static. A whisper rose behind me, soft and sibilant, but there was nothing there, only the window and the vast mirror of water outside. The hairs on my arms lifted. The whisper steadied into a pattern, a cadence that matched the thrum I'd felt in the floor below. It sounded like someone counting, slowly and methodically, or like a tide marking time. I should have climbed back through the hatch. Instead, I leaned out and looked down. The water lapped at the foundation below, and where it touched the walls, faces pressed up against the glass and stucco from the inside. Not full faces, just eyes and mouths, and the pale curve of cheekbones. Flattened like creatures trying to see out of a fishbowl, they stared upward at me, and though their features were blurred by the water, I felt their attention as a weight. One of them lifted an arm. The movement was deliberate. The hand rose and then flattened against the underside of the roof, where my wet prints had already smudged the tiles I'd touched. Something tapped on the shingles beside me. It was a subtle sound at first, like a pebble hitting the roof, then again, faster, a staccato rhythm that matched the counting. I looked down and saw, beneath the tile's sheen, a slow circulation of air bubbles rising to the surface, steamy mouths opening and closing under the water. Each released a small, wet laugh. Then, a new handprint materialized beside mine, as if pressed from below up against the tile. The fingers splayed and seeking the edge. My fingers went numb. I climbed back through the window without thinking, slamming the hatch shut behind me. The latch resisted, a soft, wet pressure pressing against it from the other side. As I staggered away, the counting stopped. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the wind and the distant creak of the house settling. Then, from somewhere below, a single, slow knock sounded directly under my feet. I froze, and it was followed by another, but this one was not from the house. It was from the roof itself, a dull internal thump that matched the beat of my own heart. When I set my foot down, something cold and papery curled between my toes. I looked down and found not water or mud, but a small wet scrap of skin, pulped and fresh, folded like a note. Even in the gray light I could see fine Rigostini prints pressed into it, and the faintest trace of a name carved in the flesh. The letters were too soft to make out clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. It began with the same letter as my own. I don't know when exhaustion finally overcame fear, but at some point, I lost the strength to keep moving. My body gave in, and I drifted into a restless state that was neither sleep nor waking. I dreamt of drowning, of floating face down on black water that stretched forever, yet I could still feel the roof beneath me, trembling like it was alive. I opened my eyes with a start and found myself lying on something that wasn't wood at all. The shingles, the attic, the walls, everything had vanished. My house was gone. Beneath me was a surface smooth and pale, damp beneath my palms, and pulsing faintly, like flesh stretched over bone. It was not a raft, not wreckage, it was alive. I scrambled to my knees, looking around, but there was nothing, no horizon, no sun, no clouds, only an endless gray sky and endless black water, the two melting into each other as though the world had been erased. My stomach churned when I realized the surface I was on curved slightly downward in all directions. I was not standing on wreckage. I was kneeling on the back of something vast, something submerged just below the surface. My hands pressed against it, and I felt a vibration deep inside, steady and slow, like the beating of a colossal heart. It thrummed up through my arms into my chest until my own pulse tried to match it. The whispers that had haunted me inside the house were gone now, replaced by something worse, silence, so heavy it made my ears ring. I wanted to call out, to scream, but the air felt thick, as if my voice would not carry anywhere. Then the silence broke. The water shifted with a sound like mountains grinding together, and something rose from the surface in the distance. At first I thought it was a hill, slick with rain, but then it lifted higher, dripping sheets of black water. A head, massive, swollen, pale as the surface I was kneeling on. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, only the impression of a face worn smooth, like flesh that had been washed blank. And yet I felt its attention turn toward me, sharper than any gaze I had ever endured. My breath caught in my throat. My body wouldn't move. The water around me stirred. Shapes broke the surface, pale limbs, too long and thin, rising like branches from the depths. They reached upward in silence, fingers splayed, grasping at air. Some curled back into the water, others hovered, trembling as though waiting for permission. The head tilted, a motion slow and deliberate, and every limb in the water mirrored it, turning toward me with one single, unified intent. My legs shook as I tried to crawl backward, but the surface shifted beneath me. It was no longer still, it flexed, sagging like muscle under strain, threatening to pull me down. I screamed without meaning to, a sound torn from me by panic, but the sound was swallowed instantly, absorbed by the water and the thing beneath me. In that moment, I knew there was no sky, no air, no separation. The world itself was inside this creature, and I was only a stray thought it hadn't yet decided to erase. The pale head leaned closer. Its blank surface rippled, and for a moment I thought I saw impressions forming, eyes pressing outward, mouths stretching across its skin, dozens of them, all screaming silently beneath a thin layer of flesh. The mouths opened wider, their silent cries building into a pressure that made the water tremble. My ears popped painfully, and I clutched the sides of my head, trying to block out a sound that wasn't even sound at all. It was inside me, filling me, shaping my thoughts until they weren't mine anymore. I realized, too late, what had happened. The flood had never been a storm. It had never been weather. It was this thing, this vast, ancient body rising from the deep, swallowing land, swallowing time itself. The water wasn't water at all, but part of it, an extension of its flesh, a sea that was alive, that had lured me in and stripped away everything else. My house, my town, the world, they had all been claimed, pulled into its body. The pale limbs reached higher now, curling over me, blotting out what little light remained. They didn't grab or strike. They hovered, patient, waiting for me to accept. My name whispered through the air again, but this time it came from within me, in my own voice, spoken with a weight that didn't belong to me. I clutched at my chest and felt it water inside, pressing upward, filling the spaces where breath should be. My lungs shuddered, as if they had become gills. I wanted to fight, to resist, but my body betrayed me. My fingers pressed down into the flesh I stood on, sinking deeper as though I belonged there. The pale head drew nearer until it filled my vision completely, blank and infinite. The mouths beneath its skin moved again, and though I could not hear them, I understood. They weren't warning me. They weren't calling for help. They were welcoming me. As the surface sank beneath me and the water closed over my head, the last thing I saw was one of the mouths pressing against the inside of its skin, stretching wide. And behind the translucent layer, I saw something unmistakable. My own face, distorted and pale, staring back at me, already part of the flood.